Hi and welcome everyone, I'm Gavin Lon. In this video, we are going to leverage a Blazor WebAssembly component and a WebAPI component to create a basic movie review application. We'll create this application on .NET 8. I'll demonstrate how to integrate a Blazor WebAssembly child component that resides outside the main Blazor Web App Project into a parent component that resides within the Blazor Web App Project. The new Blazor Web App Project template that has been introduced with .NET 8. The significance of the Blazor Web App Project template is that it can be used to include the new features introduced with .NET 8, namely server-side rendering and streaming rendering, along with the features with which we are already familiar, namely Blazor WebAssembly and Blazor Server. For an overview of the new Blazor features shipped with .NET 8, please check out this video. To support the channel, please like this video and please consider subscribing. Please also ring the bell so that you'll be notified of future content. Please feel free to share this video with anyone you feel may benefit from its content. If you'd like to thank me by buying me a coffee, you can do this through my Buy Me a Coffee webpage. It will of course be greatly appreciated. I've recently joined X, formerly Twitter, so please feel free to follow me on X. I love reading your comments, so please feel free to engage with me in the comments section. Right, let's get into this video. Right, so the first thing we're going to do is install Visual Studio Code. So it's a very simple process. We can just look for Visual Studio Code here and navigate to this location in our browsers. And we've got a number of options here. I'm on a Windows platform, so I'm going to simply press the Download for Windows button here to install Visual Studio Code. And it's that simple. It downloads the executable into your Downloads folder. Okay, and then we can navigate to the Downloads folder and we can just double-click it, double-click the relevant executable. Okay, I'm not actually going to run the installation because I've already got Visual Studio installed on my local machine. But if you simply double-click the relevant exe from your Downloads folder, follow the step-by-step instructions and install Visual Studio Code, because we're going to use Visual Studio Code to create our application in this video. The next installation I will follow along with you because I don't have the latest release of .NET 8, which is RC number 2. So I'm going to just go .NET 8 SDK. I'm going to search for .NET 8 SDK. Let's navigate to this URL. And here we have it. So the latest go live release is RC.2. So this is the one I want to install. So I've got a Windows platform, so I'm going to install the X64 release. So I'm going to download that to my Downloads folder. Okay, great. Let's open the Downloads folder and then we can just install the latest version of .NET 8, which is a go live version of .NET 8 by simply double clicking on the relevant exe and following the step-by-step instructions to install this version of .NET 8. So this is obviously not the official release of .NET 8. It's a go live version of .NET 8. It's a release candidate version. So that's what the RC means. RC, release candidate. So I'm going to press the install button here. And off it goes. It's going to install this version of .NET 8 on my local machine. Great, so that should be installed now. To verify that we've installed the relevant version, we can simply invoke Visual Studio Code, and then we can just type at the terminal prompt. We can then type .NET -- version, and that looks great. RC version 2. So we've got the correct release candidate of .NET 8 installed. So we're now ready to create our application using Visual Studio Code and the latest release candidate of .NET 8. If you haven't yet installed the C# Dev Kit extension, it is highly recommended that you do install this extension before developing C# applications using Visual Studio Code. To install the C# Dev Kit extension, simply click on the Extensions option within Visual Studio Code, search for C# like this, select C# Dev Kit and install the extension. Okay, so you can see that by default I've got a project already loaded. So one way to create a new project in Visual Studio Code is to simply create a new folder. So I'm going to create a new folder here. This could be referred to as the root folder for this application. I'll call this folder Blazor Movie Web App, like that. So we've got the folder there. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and then we can simply open that folder. Let's go open folder, and we want to go into source like this. We've got Blazor Movie Web App folder, and this is the one we want. So let's select that option, and this is our root folder for our application. And then we can just launch the terminal window and use the .NET SDK CLI to generate the relevant projects that we're going to create in this video. So the projects we're going to create are a Blazor Web App Project. So this will create a project which would have formerly been known as a Blazor United project, but we no longer use the nomenclature of Blazor United. Blazor Web App is a project template we can leverage so that we can incorporate the new features that are to be released with .NET 8 into our project. So that includes server-side rendering, streaming rendering. We can incorporate both a Blazor WebAssembly component as well as a Blazor server component within the same project. So the first project we're going to create will be derived from the Blazor Web App Project template. So in order to create a project derived from the Blazor Web App Project template, we can run this CLI command at our terminal prompt. Okay, so the correct CLI command is .NET new followed by a reference to the relevant Blazor Web App Project template, which is simply Blazor, like this, within our command, -o, and then we can express the folder path in which we want our relevant project files to reside. So in this case, it's going to be projects / and I'm going to call this project movie web, like this, and press the enter key. Excellent. So that has now created the relevant Blazor Web App project and the relevant directory structure there, and we can see that there. Great. So we could actually just test that that has run correctly. So in order to run this project, we can navigate to the appropriate directory like this. Projects, movie web, like this. And now that we're in the appropriate directory, we can simply run the project. .NET run, like that. Great, and it's listening at this location here. So we can just copy that URL into the browser address here. And there we go. It's set up the basics for our Blazor Web App project, which we've named Movie Web. So now that we've got that project, we're going to create, let's cancel that by pressing Control-C, clear the screen. And now we're going to create the Blazor WebAssembly project. So we're going to create our Blazor WebAssembly components within a separate project, and we're going to reference this project and then incorporate the relevant Blazor WebAssembly components within the Blazor Web App project. Okay, so let's go back to the root directory, and we can do that with this command. Okay, we can see that we're in the appropriate directory there, the appropriate current directory. And now, in order to create our Blazor WebAssembly project, we can run this command, .NET new. So we've got to include a reference to the correct project template. And we can do that by referencing Blazor WASM like this, and then -o, and then the relevant directory. And we call this MovieWasm. Press the Enter key. Excellent. So it looks like that's been created successfully. And so we've got our MovieWasm project created here. So this project will never run standalone. We're only going to be referencing the relevant components created in this project from the MovieWeb project, which is derived from the Blazor Web App Project's template, where, as discussed, we can leverage all the new features due to be released with .NET 8. So within the MovieWasm folder, we need to make a few alterations, just so that there's no conflicts between the MovieWeb project and the MovieWasm project. So, first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the www root directory. So let's just delete that. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is remove the app.razor component, which we also don't need. So let's delete that. And then we can appropriately update the program.cs file like this. We can delete these lines of code here. And I'm just going to, for now, comment this line of code out. So let's just make sure that we can indeed reference the components that reside within the MovieWasm project from within the MovieWeb project. So I'm going to alter the counter component, and then we'll incorporate the counter component within the home parent component that resides within the MovieWeb project. So let's appropriately alter this. So because this is now going to be a child component, we can remove this routing information here. We can remove that there. And we can just leave the rest as is. Let's save that. And then what we need to do is reference the MovieWasm project from within our MovieWeb project. We need to run the appropriate command in order to reference the MovieWasm project from within the MovieWeb project. So let's run the appropriate CLI command to reference the MovieWasm project from within the MovieWeb project. So it's .NET add projects. We need to reference the MovieWeb project like this. And then include the reference keyword here, and then the project that we want to reference, which in this case is MovieWasm. And that looks correct, and let's see if that works. Reference to MovieWasm, MovieWasm.csproj added to the project. And let's see if that has indeed done what we asked it to do. And there it is. So we've referenced the WebAssembly project from within the MovieWeb project. So we can actually test this by incorporating the counter component here within our home component here. Great. So before we do that, let's actually delete this component here first, because we're not interested in that component. We're only interested in referencing the counter component that resides within the MovieWasm project. So we need to, within the imports.razor file, we need to include a using directive to the MovieWasm WASM dot components dot pages namespace like this, so that we can reference the counter component that resides within the MovieWasm project. Okay, so let's go to the home component here, and let's include a reference to the counter component. So we just go counter, counter like that. So in order to be able to integrate a Blazor WebAssembly component within our main Blazor Web App project, we must first include a dependency within our Blazor Web App project, a specific dependency. So we can do this by including a package reference to the appropriate version of the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Components.WebAssembly.Server Nuget package. What we need to do here is actually add a package, which is the Microsoft ASP.NET Core.Components.WebAssembly.Server package. So .NET add package, and then we can include the relevant package that we want. Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Components.WebAssembly.Server. And we also want to include a particular version, so we can include the version option like this, and then the relevant version we want. And I'm just going to put 8.0.0-RC.2 like this, and see if that works. So let's press the enter key. Looks promising. So if we go to the actual project file, okay, it's including the correct package that we want. It's including a reference to it here. And we can see that within our movieweb.cs file. So we've included a package reference here. Got a project reference to the MovieWasm project, and we've got a package reference here. And we're including this particular package because we need to include this Nuget package in order to reference the relevant Blazor WebAssembly component from within our MovieWeb project, which is derived from the Blazor Web App Project template. Okay. So, excellent. So let's clear the screen. There's a few other steps that need to be made here. So if we go to first step, we go to program. The first step is we go to the program.cs file within our Movie Web App project. Okay, and we need to chain this command. So add interactive WebAssembly components like this. Okay, and we need to do a similar thing down here and go add interactive WebAssembly render mode. So that's what we're missing there within our program.cs file within the Movie Web project. So now that we've got that there, we actually need to include an attribute that tells the compiler that we want this component rendered as a WebAssembly component. So now we can do that by including the render mode attribute within the counter element like this. So render mode equals to, and let's include the interactive WebAssembly render mode. Type .NET run. So we can just copy this location here appropriately into our browser window. And we have now successfully integrated the counter component from a Blazor WebAssembly project within our Blazor Web App Project, within the home component of the Blazor Web App Project. So we've actually successfully integrated a WebAssembly component that exists within a project derived from the Blazor WebAssembly project template into a project that is derived from the Blazor Web App Project, which is a new project template included with the release of .NET 8, which enables us to include the new enhancements that come with .NET 8, like server-side rendering and streaming rendering, along with components that we're used to with Blazor, like Blazor WebAssembly components and Blazor server components. Great. So that's excellent. So now we can build our application now that we've got the infrastructure successfully in place. But before we develop the client, let's develop the server functionality that I want to include in this video. So in order to do that, I'm just going to navigate back to the root folder like this with this command. Let's create our web API, and by default it's going to create this project as a minimal web API, which means we're not going to be including the MVC model view controller functionality within this project. We're just going to use the minimal features we need to create our web API project. So in order to create our Blazor Web API project, we can type this command. .NET new web API -o, and then followed by projects. This is the directory in which we want our Blazor Web API files to reside. So we go projects, and then let's call this Movie Web API. So this is going to be called Movie Web API. The project file will be called moviewebAPI.csproj. Okay, so I think that looks correct. And let's press the Enter key. Okay, and that looks positive. Great. And you can see within our projects folder, we have the Movie Web API project generated for us. That's great. And we're going to be just working within the program.cs file, which, as you can see, contains all the routing functionality, all the default routing functionality. At the moment, we have one endpoint included by default, which is the weather forecast endpoint. And we can actually test this endpoint right off the bat, as it were, by running the project. So let's run the project. And what it's done is it's actually included Swagger functionality within our project by default. So we can use Swagger to test the relevant endpoints. As I say, at this point, we only have one endpoint set up, and that's the weather forecast endpoint with some default data that can be returned to us through a GET request. Okay, so let's run our Web API project. Let's type dot. Let's first go into the current directory for our Web API project. So cd project / movie web API, and then we go .NET run. Okay, we can just simply copy this URL to our browsers. Our endpoint is called weather forecast, so we can just copy that there, and this should return us some results. And there it is. So this returns our weather data. But we can also use Swagger by navigating to the Swagger endpoint here. And you can see here we have a UI set up for us where we can actually test our relevant endpoints. So that's really convenient. Right off the bat, by default, we can use Swagger to test our relevant endpoints. So you just click try it out, execute, and it returns the relevant weather data. So that's excellent. So we've got our Web API project basically set up for us. Okay. So the next step is we want to develop the functionality for our API. Okay, so in order to expedite the process, I'm just going to copy the code that I've already created on GitHub, and then we can build up the functionality for our web API, for our movie application. Okay, so let's go to the relevant GitHub repository. So this folder here contains the basic functionality that I want to include in this application. So firstly, let's go to this file here, and I'm just going to copy this code from GitHub, from this location on GitHub, because we're just going to store our data for our movies within a list. So we can just copy that and we can paste it here like that. And that's pretty much our data. But we don't have the model yet. The movie model has not yet created. We're actually not going to use a class here. We're going to use a record type in this application. So we're going to make a few alterations to this code. I've included a link in the description to the code we're creating in this project. So you can just simply go to that link and copy and paste the relevant data from the appropriate GitHub web page if you don't want to tap out the code like I'm going to do here. Okay, so the next step, instead of including a class, I actually want to include a record. So let's include a definition for our movie record. So the following fields need to be included. So we have an ID field or ID property for a particular movie record. We want to include a string property for the title and a string property for the description of the movie, a string property for the image URL, so where the image is, so the path where a poster image regarding the relevant movie will be stored. We'll include the relevant images in our Movie Web App project in just a bit, but let's first create the code for our Web API. Okay, and then we want to include a review for each of our movies, and we can do that in this particular review field here. Okay, so we've set up our movie record. So within the current code here, we're referring to a movie model. This movie model was a class that we created in the previous project. So if we go here, you can see that we had this class, movie model, a definition for this class, and we're going to use a record instead of a class for this particular application. So we need to alter the code a little bit here, so that refers to movie record rather than movie model. That there, and we just appropriately create a movie record like that. So we're just going to alter this code so that it's appropriate to our purposes here. We just need to set the variable movies to the new list. So instead of directly assigning the properties like this for the movie review, for the movie record, we're going to simply pass them into a constructor. So I'm just going to take a copy of that and I'll just show you how we're going to appropriately alter the code here. So we're simply going to, instead of using curly brackets, we're going to use these brackets here, and we're just going to pass in the values directly like this. Okay, we can get rid of that there. Okay, so take this here, just needs to be Godfather 2, update the image there. And that's Godfather sorted out. Okay, we can get rid of that there, and we can just create, we can just repeat this process. So we're using our record rather than class. Do that right there. Okay. Record for window, great talk movie. Okay. Leave that there. You can see we just appropriating our code to the new record type rather than the old class related syntax we had previously. Okay. Oops. Needs to be house. There. Okay. So we can do that and appropriately adjust this data related code. So just like that there. Start for the image. And just leave that there. And I think our data's looking pretty good there. Godfather, Lost the Mohicans, Rear Window, Roadhouse, and Star Trek 4. Yeah. Okay. That looks pretty good. Let's just see if we can build that. We haven't made any subtle mistakes there. 0 errors, that's what we like to see. 0 warnings, build succeeded. Okay, that's great. So now, what this means is we can create our first endpoint because we're ready for that. Okay, so I'm just going to duplicate this code here for the endpoint. And let's create our endpoint that will return our movies. And the code for this is very simple. So we go movies, like that there. That's the name of our endpoint. And let's remove all of this weather forecast related functionality. And then we're simply going to return movies like that. We're just going to return our list of movies. We're just going to call this endpoint from within our MovieWasm project. Great. Okay, so we can actually test this endpoint by using Swagger. So let's do that. Let's go .NET run. And let's copy this to our browser. Let's leave that for the time being there. Copy this to our browser. And let's go to our Swagger endpoint here where we've got our UI, and you can see we've got our new movies endpoint available to us, and we can even try it out. Try it out, execute, and there we go. We've got our movie records appropriately returned to us. So we've implemented our code for our first endpoint successfully. That's excellent. Okay, let's see if we can, let's set up our code so that we can now call this endpoint from within the MovieWasm component. So the first thing we need to do is set up the base URL. So that's the URL that our MovieWasm component is going to reference. So to do that, let's go within the MovieWeb project. Let's go to the program.cs file. And within the program.cs file, let's set up a dependency injection for the HTTP client. And if we go to the WASM, the MovieWasm program.cs file here, you can see that by default it's included code to set up a HTTP client. So what we're going to do is copy that code and include it within the MovieWeb project within the program.cs file of the MovieWeb project. So let's paste the code here, comment it back in, and we need to replace this argument with the URL where our endpoints reside. So this is the base address of our WebAPI component. And in order to find the base address, we can go to our MovieWebAPI project, and we can go to the launch settings.json file, and we can just copy it from here so that we can test our code. So let's go to the program.cs file within the MovieWeb project, and let's paste that appropriately here. And this is setting up dependency injection so that the HTTP client is injected appropriately within the relevant components within the MovieWasm project. Okay, so let's create our first component. So within the pages folder in our MovieWasm project, let's create a new component and let's name it movies.razor. And let's create another component called movie item. And now this is going to be a child component that will represent an individual movie. So I'm going to call this movie item.razor, like that. And then we're just going to copy and paste the relevant code from GitHub. So let's go back to GitHub. Let's find the relevant components. So movie item.razor here. And let's just simply copy that and paste it here. And it's included a special character there, so let's just delete that. Okay, and we can do the same for the movies.razor component. So let's find the relevant code on GitHub, and it's actually within the index.razor file in this particular case. Okay, and we just want to include this code here. We don't need to include all of this code because within this particular project, this component was a parent component. So there was direct routing code available here to the relevant component. And our component within our project is actually going to be a child component. So we don't want to include all of this particular code here. But we will include appropriate dependency injection code in a bit. So let's copy that code and paste it here. So we need to replace this code here to a call to our WebAPI endpoint. So we want to include the relevant dependency injection code so the HTTP client is injected into this component. So let's include an inject directive here, followed by HTTP client, and we'll just call this HTTP. Okay. And then we can include the appropriate code to call our Web API. Before we include our endpoint code, we need to create a definition for a particular movie. And we're going to do that in much the same way we did in the Web API component. We're going to create a record type that represents a particular movie. So to do that, let's go to this root directory here and let's create a new folder. And let's call this folder records. And let's create a class file to house our record type. So let's just create a class and let's call this class MovieRecord.cs here. And I'm going to house this within a particular namespace. I'm going to call the namespace MovieWasm.records, like that. And then we can create our record definition. And we want this record to be public, so public record movie record. In fact, let's just copy and paste the code from the Web API because it does need to be identical to the record definition that we've defined within the relevant Web API component. So let's just take that, copy it, and paste it here. But we do want this record to be public. So let's give it the public access modifier like this. And then in order for this record to be accessible from within our components, we can simply include an appropriate reference within the imports.razor file here. So let's include a directive using MovieWasm.records, like that. So, yep, MovieWasm.records. Just make sure that that's 100% accurate before we move on. Okay, so let's go back to our component code here. And let's change this here to reference movie record rather than movie model, like this. And then we can actually write the code to call our endpoint. Movies equals to await HTTP. We want get from JSON async, like this. And we want it to be strongly typed with our movie record because it's going to return to us a list of movie records. And then we simply pass in the movies endpoint like this. Great. So let's make sure that we are referencing movie record here rather than movie model. And we need to do the same in the movie item component here. So this should be movie record, not movie model. We must make sure that we have all the images, and we're going to store this within the MovieWeb project. So we go to www root, and let's create a new folder named images, and within that folder let's create a new folder named movies. Great. Okay, so now we need to copy and paste the relevant images to this directory. So I'm going to navigate there, reveal in File Explorer. I actually have these on my local machine, but you can download them from this location on GitHub. Go here. And here they are. Here are all the images for the movies that we are including in our application. So you can just download these to your local machine and include them appropriately in your project. But I actually already have these images available. So I'm just going to quickly... Great, so I've now pasted in those images. If we look at it in large icons, you can see those posters are now copied into the appropriate directory in my MovieWeb project. We can actually see them here within Visual Studio. Excellent. Okay, that's brilliant. We haven't actually integrated the movies component within our MovieWeb project yet, so that's the next thing to do. So let's navigate Components, Pages, Home, and instead of incorporating the counter component, we're going to incorporate the movies component within our home component. And let's see if this works out. Okay, so let's test our code. Firstly, let's navigate to the current directory where our MovieWeb project resides. So let's go MovieWeb here, enter, and then just type .NET run. Okay, so it's got a problem with the name that I've chosen there, movies. So I'm actually, a quick way to fix this is just to change that. It's because we're referring to the collection also as movies, and we're referring to movies.razor there. So it looks as though it doesn't like that. It's conflicting with the movies razor file. So let's change the name of this to movie items.razor. There. Okay, and this has actually got a capital, so we want to also capitalize this particular variable, so that would have caused a problem also. Let's try again. Okay, so we've got a few things we're going to need to fix here before we run our code and test our application. This is called movies items currently, so I need to rename that to movie items, which makes more sense. And then this over here should not be movie record, but should be strongly typed as list movie record, a list that is strongly typed with our movie record type. So let's go back here. So this now should reference movie items. This code here within the home component within the MovieWeb App Project should reference the movie items component that resides within the MovieWasm project. And I think we're pretty much good to go. So if our client code attempts to call any of the endpoints within our WebAPI component, currently a CAUSE-related exception will be thrown. What is CAUSE? CAUSE stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. CAUSE defines a way for client web applications that are loaded in one domain to interact with resources in a different domain. So our client code resides in a different domain to the domain in which our web API component resides. So in order for our client to access resources returned from our web API component, we must include appropriate CAUSE-related code so that our web API explicitly permits our client to have the appropriate access permissions to resources returned from our web API component. So you must include this CAUSE-related code appropriately within the web API component. So what we want to do is then run the Web API project. So that's running in the background. And then run our MovieWeb project. And then we can test our code. So to do that, I'm just going to create a new instance of the terminal of the PowerShell here. So plus, and we're going to use this to run our Web API. We're going to use this terminal window to run our Web API. I'm going to navigate into the directory where our MovieWeb API project resides. So project / MovieWeb API. Great, we're in the correct current directory, and then we can just go .NET run. So that should be running in the background now at this, and it's listening at this location. And let's go back to our original terminal window here. And then we can run this code. Okay. And let's copy that location to our browser window here, and let's see what happens. Great, so it's displaying our movies as expected. So when I first ran the code, I noticed that I was getting a dependency injection related error message in my browser. i.e. regarding injecting a HTTP client object into my WebAssembly component. The error seems to be of no real consequence. The code still worked as expected. But I noticed that when I included this dependency injection related code that I already had included within the program.cs file in the Blazor Web App Project, also within the program.cs file within the Blazor WebAssembly project, that I no longer received the error message in my browser. So the next step is we want to create an endpoint within our WebAPI project where we can retrieve just one movie from our collection of movies. Okay, so let's create an endpoint because we want to just display one particular movie with its movie review next to it. So we'll create the component for this after we've created the relevant WebAPI code. Okay, so let's go into the program.cs file within our MovieWebAPI project, and let's create an endpoint that's responsible for retrieving one movie record. So let's just make a duplicate of this to start off, and then we can create the actual endpoint. So we want to include an ID parameter for this particular endpoint. So it's the ID of the relevant movie we want retrieved. So this ID needs to be included in the endpoint path for when a client retrieves a particular movie from the movies collection. So then let's include the ID here, parameter definition for this expression, and then we can simply use link, the single or default extension method, to filter our movies collection down to a particular movie. And this can be get movies by ID. Great, that looks pretty good. Okay, let's just go here. Let's just make sure that our code works. We can actually test this using Swagger before we implement our client code. So let's go .NET run. Let's go here. So let's go to our Swagger UI. Movies ID, try it out, and we can include, let's go try it out. So let's just say ID number 2, execute. Great, and it brings back Godfather, the Godfather. So that's the correct item. That's the movie that has an ID of 2. So the correct item has been retrieved through a call to our endpoint. Excellent. So let's go back to our code and let's build the client code for this. So first thing, let's create a parent component within the movie app project. So let's go to pages here. Let's create a file called MovieReview.Razor here. Excellent. So this is the movie review parent component. And within this parent component, we'll reference a child component that resides within the MovieWasm project that will house the actual code for the movie review component. So within this child component, we'll have code that calls the relevant endpoint that will retrieve a particular movie, and then the child component will be responsible for displaying the movie poster image and the corresponding movie review within the relevant child component. Okay, so we need to include the relevant page directive for our parent movie review component within the movie web project. So let's go there, let's go type movie review like that, and then we can actually create the code for the client review logic within the MovieWasm project. So to do that, let's create a file named review.razor like that. And let's actually copy the code. So I'm going to have to navigate back to the relevant GitHub repository. So I'm just going to copy the code, the relevant code from GitHub. So if we go to the movie review code here, we can actually just copy the code from here. As a starting point for our movie review child component, and then we can just adapt it for our project, for our particular project. Okay, so the code's going to be a little bit different here. So movie item, so this should be movie record here. This parameter should be an integer. Let's take that out there. And then we need to inject the HTTP client. So let's copy the relevant injection code, dependency injection code, where the HTTP client is appropriately injected into the relevant component. So let's include this code at the top. The injection code, dependency injection code. So then we can use the HTTP client to appropriately call the relevant endpoint. So let's just copy the relevant functionality that uses the HTTP client to call the relevant endpoint from code that we've already created within the movie items razor component here. So I'm just going to copy that there. Well, actually, let's just copy this part of the code. And then go back to review.razor and paste that there. And now we want to include, we can use string interpolation to include the relevant ID parameter within our path to the relevant endpoint. Great, so that should be good. So we're now retrieving information for one particular movie. And that looks pretty good for our client component. I think that's right. And then we can include a reference to this child component from within the parent movie review component. So just copy this code here as a starting point, and then we want to reference the review component here. That's the correct render mode. And we're actually going to be passing a parameter to this root. So we can actually define our root appropriately like this, so that an ID parameter, which is constrained to the int data type, is in fact passed to this root. And then in the @code section of this parent component, we must include the appropriate parameter. So public int ID get set. So we've got an auto implemented property. We must declare as a parameter using the appropriate parameter attribute like this. As you can see, within the code we've actually already copied from GitHub. You can see we're actually referencing that particular root here. So this root must match the root we're declaring for the review, for the movie review component, parent component within the MovieWeb project. So that looks correct. And then we must actually pass this parameter down to the child component. And we can simply do that by including the appropriate attribute like this. Okay. Oops, and I nearly forgot. So now this just needs to be a single record. So we don't want this to be strongly typed as a list. We want this call to this particular endpoint to return one record, one movie record, and not a list of records. So that would have resulted in an error there. So we've just corrected a potential bug there. Okay. So our web API is actually already running. We tested our new endpoint that just returns one record. We tested that already. So we haven't stopped this from running. It's still running in the background. Let's run our movie app project. Great. Hopefully great. We'll see. Not so great. Cannot convert int to string. Oh, okay. So this code needs to be adapted because we've strongly typed it to an integer now. Okay, let's try again. I think that was our problem. Great. Okay, so that was our problem. And let's copy that location to our browser window and see what we've got. Perfect, that looks good so far. Now let's see what happens if we click on a particular item. Perfect, that's worked straight away. So that's our application, done. Excellent. I hope you enjoyed this demonstration where we integrated a Blazor Web Assembly component within our Blazor Web App project and called a WebAPI component that we created in order to retrieve the relevant movie data. Our code within the relevant WebAssembly components could then display the relevant movie data in an aesthetically pleasing way within our browser. To support the channel, please like this video and please consider subscribing. Please also ring the bell so that you'll be notified of future content. Please feel free to share this video with anyone you feel may benefit from its content. If you'd like to thank me by buying me a coffee, you can do this through my Buy Me a Coffee webpage at this location. It will of course be greatly appreciated. I've recently joined X, formerly Twitter, so please feel free to follow me on X. My username is @GavinLonDigital. I love reading your comments, so please feel free to engage with me in the comments section. The code created in this video can be accessed on GitHub. Please see a link to the relevant repository below in the description of this video. I hope to see you soon. Thank you and take care.